All right, so now we can talk about the historical methods of analysis. So, no, in this lecture, we've talked about historical significance. We've talked about the sources of history as an academic discipline of study. And now the question is, how do you put these sources together in order for you to create a historical narrative? Now, we've seen some of these things before, particularly itong elements of history which describe temporality, spatiality, and subject. So, the when, where, and who of history. What we're going to do in this presentation is look at the categories of analysis which undergo temporality and spatiality. So, ito munang periods, no? Ay, temporality pala. So, when we talk about time in history, there are different scales of time that we use in trying to describe our topics of study. Now, one of the most important time scales is periods. So, pag sinabi nating may periodization, ibig sabihin we cut up history into different segments of time. Now, periods themselves are longer time spans which more or less share common characteristics. The basis of periodization will depend on the topic, but they generally represent phases in the development of a certain history. Now, next we have events. And don't worry if you're having like trouble thinking about, okay, what is a period anyway? We're gonna use the example of Philippine history in the next slide. So, i-define muna natin kung ano yung time spans or scales or units na tinitignan natin. The next thing are events. Now, within these periods are events which tell us about the specific historically significant moments or events which shape human dynamics during those times. So, events ay yung kunyari, the 1896 revolution, um, like the arrival of the Spaniards, the beginning of American colonization through the American-Philippine War. So, yung mga events na yan tell us about these specific moments, which were important in characterizing or giving different dynamics to that period. So, we also have something called turning points. These are special kinds of events which distinguish one period from another. So within periods na may mga events ka, ayan, for example, within Spanish colonization, you have all kinds of moments where they started to Christianize different parts of the Philippines, and all of that would fall under the Spanish colonial period. But then you would have a turning point which would shift the period. We're no longer talking about something that more or less shares common characteristics, but now a radically different way of life, which yes might have some level of continuity, pero kung titignan mo yung political system or yung economic system, there are drastic changes which tell us na ibang phase na to in the development of a particular history. Now, remember, turning points are events, and events can be one-shot things, one-shot happenings. For example, one particular battle or one particular, for example, the signing of the Treaty of Paris, right? But events can also have longer ish time spans. For example, the Philippine American War would be considered an event, even if it lasted for about 2 years. So the Philippine Revolution, in a way, is one long moment or event. Now, okay, as History 1 students, what exactly are you guys going to be using in terms of describing events? We're not going to get too technical into it now. Pero basically, for you guys, okay nang alalahanin na may mga periods, which is really longer spans of time, events, which is the moments which describe those uh, key developments within those periods, and turning points as those events which will radically shift our history from one period to another. Now, examples, right? Each of these puzzle pieces, as we've tackled before, represents one period in history. So we have the peopling of the Philippines as our prehistoric period. You'll find out what that is in Module 3. The early settlements period, ayan, characterized, diba? There are common characteristics here. The early settlements period, even if we have many different kinds of societies which exist here, represents overall the development of a Philippine tradition of social, economic, and political stratification. So iba-ibang kinds of societies ang mahahanap natin dyan, which were foundational to many of the societies which continue to exist today, even with the entry of colonization. So ano nga ba yung mga na-develop dito? For example, our languages, Filipino languages, like Kapampangan, Tagalog, um, Bisaya, when the Ilocano even, and many, many other Philippine languages. So pagdating ng mga Spanish dito, nag-exist na yung languages na yan. And languages don't just pop up at random moments in time. They develop, right? So the early settlements period has actually been called the parang ethnicization of the Philippines. So dito nabuo yung ethnic groups natin and different kinds of political configurations. For example, like the sultanates of Sulu and Mindanao, or actually more of the Sultanate of Sulu and the beginnings of the Sultanate of Mindanao. Dito natin makikita na nahuhubog yung mga traditions natin na pre-colonial. And, some of them would continue to develop across time. Yun. So that's the period of the early settlements, right? Ano yung mga events na makikita natin dito na kasama pa rin sa same period? One major event during this time was the formation of the Sulu Sultanate. I think it was in 1450, basta sometime in the 15th century, nabuo yung Sulu Sultanate. And that would mark the beginning of one of the most politically complex systems in the Philippines. In fact, it was so politically complex that the Spanish were unable to fully or even successfully colonize them until the late 19th century. So yung mga ganyang kinds of events, no? Ano pang event ang nangyari dyan? Medyo mahirap yung pag-date ng events sa timeline na to, lalo na kasi kulang yung written documents natin. But we know that one other important event which tells us that there was complex socio-political development during this time was the, ano ba to? The creation of the Laguna copper plate inscription, which is a primary source that tells us how there were business and political relationships between leaders in Tondo, Mindanao, and even parts of Borneo. So yeah. But what about this parang part here, no? Let's talk about turning points. So if a turning point radically shifts one period from another, definitely in this case, the turning point from early settlements to facing changes, or one of the turning points at least, was the act or the process of Spanish colonization. So Spanish colonization didn't happen just in 1 year. It happened over decades. But one of the markers of Spanish colonization was in 1565, officially na-establish yung Philippines as a colony of Spain through many smaller events. For example, yung pag-build ng isang Spanish garrison sa Cebu, yung pag-defeat ng Maynila as one of the older kingdoms in the Philippines, and it's burning to the ground, and in its place, tinayo yung Intramuros. Yung mga ganyang events tell us that there's a radical shift because now, slowly, nata-transition na yung economy natin, yung politics natin, into the system of Spanish colonization. Yun. So there are many events under this period. Pero I'm not gonna focus on that na kasi we kind of demonstrated events here in the early settlements period na. What we're gonna do is look at the turning points so we can distinguish one period from another. Now, when it comes to that division between facing changes and nationalist consciousness, the turning point really is the formation of Filipino nationalist consciousness, which begins to form in about the 1870s and will continue to be forming up until the 1880s, 1890s, ganyan. So, over this course of 3 decades, really, the idea of a Philippine nation begins to come into being as an identity that is separate from Spain. So, you know how there's this weird debate where people are like, oh, we shouldn't really celebrate the propagandists because they were really more reformist than revolutionaries. But if you look at the timeline, no, identities really take time to form. And in the case of the Philippine nationalist identity, the Ilustrados as propagandists, although they were campaigning for a kind of identity attached to Spain, they needed to do that in order for us to arrive at the next step, which was to realize that a Philippine national identity could not be accommodated within the Spanish framework. So parang step-by-step development yan, which would eventually lead to a kind of separate identity. Anyway, so kaya important yung period na to, 1872 to 1913. we have the formation of nationalist identity, which results in revolution of many different kinds. Um, you will find that in 1913, mag-end yung nationalist consciousness period, not necessarily because nag-end na rin yung development of Philippine identity, but because now there was a new framework under which nationalist identity would be negotiated. So, tumultuous or difficult period yung 1872 to 1913 kasi now it hangs in the balance the question of kung may Philippine national identity man, sino ang magtatatag ng bansa para i-represent at i-serve yung national identity na yun? Would it be the Spanish, who the Filipinos are waging a revolution against? Would it be the Filipinos? But which faction of the Filipinos who were running the revolution? Would it be the lower middle classes represented by the Katipunan or the upper provincial elite represented by the Philippine Revolutionary Government? And if that wasn't messy enough, no, biglang nag-step in yung Americans in 1898 and they said, okay, there may or may not be a nationalist movement here, but what we're gonna do is we're going to wage war against Spain and take you as a colony. And so, 1913 so yun yung parang messy kind of moment of module 6. So halo-halong iba't ibang events yan that tell us na the commonality is really trying to establish who will rule the Philippines. Now in module 7, what we see is na defeat na yung major revolutionary movements against America. The last major one being in about 1913. And this is weird to us, di ba? Kasi if you think about the Philippine Revolution, usually iisipin natin na, teka, wait, didn't Aguinaldo surrender in 1902? And therefore, doesn't that mean this periodization should end in 1902? Well, the argument by more recent historians is, even if na-defeat na yung revolution nila Aguinaldo, you still find many revolutionary movements across Luzon, Visayas, and Mindanao. Sa Luzon, meron tayong New Katipunan Movement, may the Tagalog Republic. Sa Visayas, meron yung mga Pulahanas at Dios movements who continue to wage revolution against the Americans. And in Mindanao, you have the battles of Budbagsak and Buddaho. And these really are movements continuing against the United States. But in 1913, unfortunately, most of these major smaller movements had been defeated. And now the question was, okay, how are we going to frame Filipino identity within the imposition of American democracy? Ang weird, no? Because we think about democracy as this thing which you have to choose for yourself because it represents liberty, equality, fraternity, the protection of property, and so on and so forth. But in the case of the Philippines, democracy was grafted onto our political system. So here you have the concept of a Filipino consciousness. And now you have no choice but to frame it or grow it within the framework given to you by the Americans. And really, from 1913 to 1945, the national identity of the Philippines began to be identified with a modern nation state which the Americans were kind of teaching us how to create, right? I'm not going to give a moral judgment of whether that was a good or a bad thing right now, but it is a fact of history that we needed to grow that identity within the framework of American democracy and the way it kind of melded or localized into Philippine traditions. So 1945 is a clean break because this represents the formation of an independent or fully legally independent Philippine state, right? So the independence period from 1945 to 1972 is divided by that agreement to let the Philippines go after the Commonwealth period. And so in 1946, formally na inaugurate na yung Philippine Republic. So, yung period naman nito, the commonality of the independence period is our first experiments in running our own democracy. But in the Philippine political tradition, hindi kasi tayo very democratic in the sense that more classes than just the elite were able to participate in governance. Ang alam natin na kind of governance ay really more top-down and elite-centric. So in the same way, ito yung makikita nating kind of governments under presidencies forming in the independence period. Pero as time goes by, meron ding experiments dito. Like under Ramon Magsaysay, makikita natin na that's why he's very well loved in the in the Philippine historical consciousness, because he was the first president to at least symbolically show that the average Filipino who was not part of the elite, the poorer classes, the middle classes, were people who were welcome within the realm of governance. So, di ba, he opened Malacanang to all kinds of requests and queries by people who were not necessarily well politically connected. So may mga experiments dyan. Pero ultimately, it represents a period of elite democracy that people were more and more disenchanted with. Now, turning point is 1972 kasi Marcos, in his earlier years, diba, naka 2 terms siya na legally elected siya, continued in a way that method of elite democracy. But in 1972, he was presented, or he manufactured, but was also presented with the opportunity to transform the Philippine political system. So, of course, our turning point here would be the declaration of martial law in 1972. And the period of dictatorship, as I have mentioned before in the last lecture, or in the last segment, mentioned na, okay, here's the experiment in Philippine authoritarianism. These are its potentials. The Filipinos kind of stepped back a little bit and we're like, okay, let's see what happens. But under the surface, the problems of dictatorship actually bred its own opposition. Precisely because of the problems of dictatorship that clamped down on democratic rights, the arbitrary use of military force, and so on and so forth, produced many people who were politicized in the process. So my politicization of the middle classes and even the lower classes. So the middle classes, a lot of them would become our social democrats who would be, or you could call them liberals din. Medyo weird pa yung categories at this time eh. Pero sila yung magbubuo ng liberal party represented by, your other elite who were unhappy with the martial law setup. So yung mga Aquino kasama dito. But, further down the social ladder, I guess, you also have the formation of movements like the growth of the CPP. So, nung na-declare yung martial law, actually hindi pa ganun kalakas yung Communist Party of the Philippines. Pero, lumakas sila in many ways, specifically because a lot of people who were frustrated with the dictatorship were looking for an outlet. And for many people, because the dictatorship was dealing violence on its citizens, the necessary response for many of those who went underground, nung time na nabuo yung CPP, NPA, ganyan, many people responded by also seeking methods of violence to topple the dictatorship. Right. So, mas complicated pa dun yung situation. Pero gusto ko lang ipakita na itong period under dictatorship na to ay really a challenge to what Filipinos thought they felt was a good kind of government. So, iba-iba yung naging sagot ng iba't ibang, paano ba to? Groups of society. But ultimately, it led many of us to question what exactly democracy should mean in the Philippines. So, part siya ng democratic development natin, ironically, in that way. So, ano yung clean break between Module 9 and Module 10? You have EDSA in 1986. EDSA represents the return of a different kind of governance. So, ito, under dictatorship, hindi lang na-declare yung martial law, nagkabagong constitution din tayo, and when you change constitutions kasi, mag-iiba din yung hubog ng political system mo. And in political science, ang tinatawag dito ay parang a change in republics. Yan. So, we were in the Third Republic under the independence period. And then nag-Fourth Republic tayo nung period under dictatorship. Tapos nung natopple si Marcos at, na iba yung constitution muli nung 1987, nagkaroon ulit ng Fifth Republic. So in the Fifth Republic, which is the contemporary Philippines, kasi we haven't had a change in constitutions yet, right? So, yun yung nagbabind ng natin, ng current period that we live in. So, ang argument ng class na to ay, you do see a movement towards more participatory democracy. Is it a perfect kind of participatory democracy, or is it a very well-developed kind of participatory democracy? That's up for debate. Pero the fact is, meron tayong movement towards that kind of system. Supposedly, at least in the past decades, we don't know right now what this historical moment represents. Baka naman magkaka-return tayo to authoritarianism, di ba? As previous years would suggest. But right now, this period we are currently in, the past years, are not yet up for the scrutiny of historical study kasi contemporary period pa yan. Anyway, so yun, I have demonstrated periods, events, and turning points here. Now let's talk about spatiality. And I hope you guys are still okay, no? I know this can be quite heavy and I say quite a lot, pero kung mapapansin nyo, the analysis just builds on itself. So we have some concepts we've already encountered before, and now we're just kind of trying to build up on them. Just so when it's your turn to write your narratives for our final projects, at least you'll have these ideas to use in your own periodizations or narratives. Now, let's talk about spatiality. Now, this is pretty straightforward kasi i-discuss siya in more depth sa M2, Module 2. So, for now, we need to know that there are geographic scales. So, tinitignan natin, or for you guys, yung pinaka-straightforward na ay local, regional, national, and international or global scopes. So, ang ibig sabihin nito ay, when something happens, that is historically significant, typically, you can analyze it through different geographic scales. Let's take an example from here. The declaration of martial law in 1972. What are the local events which happened? Locally, at least in the locality of Metro Manila, you had the first quarter storm in 1971. So for over a year, there were many different revolts led largely by students being waged in the streets of, I think it was Manila in particular. So, ang daming protests, may mga revolts, yung iba naging violent. In UP, nabuo yung Diliman Commune, wherein students barricaded themselves for, I think, a couple of weeks before the authorities were successfully able to break down yung barricade na yun. Anyway, so that's a local event, right? Regionally, at the time, pwede nating tignan na meron din kasing rise of a communist threat in the Philippines. So, regional as in yung regions ng Pilipinas, hindi pa Southeast Asian region. So, regionally, at the time, right before martial law was declared, you had the rise of the CPP-NPA within the areas of Central Luzon and I think parts of Nueva Ecija. So, yun yung areas kung saan parang nag-grow yung New People's Army. So, yan, meron kang communist threat in these areas. Nationally, you have the elections na parang martial law came right, hindi, para mas madali. Nationally, at the time, merong proposal for chacha or charter change. So, bago pa na declare ang martial law, on the national level, tinitignan na nila kung paano i-revise yung 1935 Constitution na namana natin from the Commonwealth period, right? Okay. So, yun. That's the national context, that's the local context, that's the regional context. But what about the international or global scopes? Now, also in the same moment, 1972, right before the declaration of martial law, you find that globally there is a climate of fear surrounding the rise of communism in different countries. So, in fact, there was something called the Truman Doctrine of intervention. Wait, baka masyado itong complicated for now. Ang sabihin na lang natin ay, mayroong global communist threat where other countries, particularly the United States and other Western powers, were intervening in third world countries pag nakikita nila na baka magka-communist threat dito. In the same way, members of the communist bloc, particularly the USSR, diba, the Soviet Union, and to an extent China din, were intervening in other countries to support local communist movements. So, may ganun ding dynamic yun. And that climate of fear, plus the opportunity to change the constitution, coalesced, or parang they met in the moment of the declaration of martial law. Kasi from there, all of these levels of fear, led to justification for martial law. And then the opportunity to change our constitution arose after yan. Dinakitiwa ang political opposition ni Marcos. Tapos now they get to change the constitution according to what they want to put in the constitution. So naging rubber stamp legislative yung ano natin, yung Senate. Anyway, so quick visualization of how there are different levels of spatial analysis. Now, okay, so may different scales ka, but you also have special themes of spatial analysis. In particular, pwede nating tignan yung relationships between conceptual spaces. For example, peripheries and centers, rural and urban spaces. So, ang ibig sabihin nito ay, conceptually, ini-imagine natin that there are certain values represented by space. So, di ba, kung from the province, di ba, kung probinsyano ka, kung taga Maynila ka, di ba sa Pilipinas, weirdly, you're either just taga Maynila or probinsyano. So, recently lang lumalabas na ina-acknowledge din yung iba't ibang syudad as urban spaces. Pero, yung mga yan ay concepts na nabuo through the kinds of services na nakikreate in these spaces. So, pag inisip natin, ano ba yung marginal or peripheral areas in the Philippines compared to the center, which is usually Manila or other urban spaces. These are conceptually created and built through human activities. Now, when it comes to relationships between geographic niches, we're talking about something that's more grounded. That's more grounded in the actual resources you find in certain areas. So, upland and lowland relationships define how people interact in those spaces, but also the opportunities and constraints available to people there. So, kung uplander ka, di ba? In just briefly imagine niyo, in the history of the Philippines, usually uplanders, particularly sa Cordilleras, will have a resource niche that depends on agriculture, sometimes sustenance agriculture, yung paggamit ng gabi, pag-terrace ng rice, ganyan. And they would have to trade with lowlanders for salt or fish or other materials na hindi nahahanap nun. So you see how these human relationships are bounded by geographical characteristics rather than conceptual characteristics. So meron ding relationship between the inlands and the coastlines. So ayan, many things there, pero for now, it's good for us to know that we can define historical space in these ways and they become lenses or methods of analysis for us to conduct our studies or research work or read and analyze particular events in the past. So ito yung sinasabi natin na you have local events. So iniba ko lang yung time span dito to focus on spatial span dito to focus on the Philippines. So you have localities and different things happening in different places. Tapos pwede mong ipagdugtong-dugtong yung mga nangyayari sa localities pag nag-introduce ka ng regional analysis. So paano ba natin mako-connect yung nangyayari sa Ilocos Sur, Ilocos Norte, and Pangasinan when we talk about the regional trading system in the Spanish period, diba? We can connect these experiences if you look at them on a regional scale. What is the system of regional trade? May regional ordinances or laws ba, etc., etc. You can also look at these within the point of view of national history. So when you want to connect Ilocano history to Kapampangan history to other histories in the Philippines, you can do this by looking at the commonalities shared in the national experience. And then, of course, in terms of the international scope naman, you can also look at the ways different international contexts affected or help explain these developments through time.